Alright, welcome back to another episode of Havoc Painting. Today, I'm going to focus in specifically on how I painted this squad of Stormcast Sequitors. I get a lot of people who ask me how I paint the gold armor on my miniatures, and also the blue. This is a color scheme that my son chose because originally I was painting these models to give to him when he got old enough to play the game. And so that's how I came up with the colors, honestly. But I like the Hammers of Sigmar that Games Workshop has in their box art, but I generally find that the blue is, when you try to shade it, it doesn't quite work with the gold. I don't like the bright gold, so I wanted to go for a brighter blue, more of turquoise color, as well as gold. I wanted it to be a bit more dark, a bit more realistic, and have good contrast to that turquoise color. Ultimately, this squad took me about 2 weeks to paint, so I'm going to try to condense it here down into about 30 minutes. We started with a base coat of any base coat, any primer will do, black, and then I hit all the low parts, and from shooting up at the bottom of the miniature with the bright bronze from Vallejo Game Air, their line. I particularly like this in the underneath parts because it gives the rest of the model a really good contrast with all the spots that aren't going to be hit with direct sunlight from above, and it's going to set a good undercoat there. Notice how I'm not painting any of the upper zenithal parts because we're going to move on then and hit it with some brighter shades of gold, specifically now glorious gold from the same Vallejo Game Air line. This is going to be our, the tone that you see straight on, and then from the zenithal position, about 30 degrees downwards towards the miniature, we've got polished gold, and this is obviously going to be the highlight color. And so this one is just shooting down. For those of you not familiar with how to do zenithal highlighting or zenithal, airbrushing, you're just essentially shooting not quite straight down onto the model, but about 30 degrees off from the very, very top position. And when it's all done, you should retain that dark color in the areas when you look up at the bottom of the miniature, and then it should look bright looking down from the top. So now we're going to start laying in our other base coats for all the robes and everything else on the model. I started with the robes doing a Rakoth flesh from Citadel Paints, and ultimately I found that I didn't like this on the exterior robes. It looked fine and it looks good on the interior robes that I wanted to be a bit cooler and a bit cleaner. But eventually I switched this to actually a Zandari dust because I wanted the exterior robes to appear just a bit dirtier. The browns of the Zandari dust, and then with some sand colors later on, are gonna just look like they're robes that are worn outside and in battle, whereas underneath that could stay the Rakoth flesh, just kind of grayish color, because that would that would be more clean, as well as the fact that the coolness of the Rakoth flesh, as opposed to the warm Zandari dust, the cool color will fall more back into the recess and the shadow, which that portion of the robes are all inside. They're inside the blue, so I do want it to appear to be further away, so that'll help, just using warm and cool colors there to our advantage. So this blue, the graphic just passed, but it's Saigar blue from P3 Miniatures. It is almost the exact same shade as Cantor blue from Citadel Miniatures. I don't know what the Vallejo line match to it is. I think a long time ago this used to be Ultramarine blue from Games Workshop or Citadel. But just putting on a thick base coat. I'm not thinning out any of these paints at this point. They're just come kind of naturally that thin that I'm gonna need to put multiple layers on to really cover it well. But just getting it in there and focusing specifically on making sure that the coverage hits all the recesses, because this is going to be the base coat and essentially the shadow color for all of the robes. I'm not so worried about making sure that all the raised portions have a good thick coat on it, because we're going to put a lot more paint over those as we go and we layer and we dry brush and stuff like that. So really just important that the deep recesses have the blue paint. The one other thing though to keep in mind is that because we used that true metallic color, if you don't get a good base coat, then the shininess, the metallic color will show through. It takes a bit of pain to cover it all up. If I were to do this again, I might actually not use the airbrush to set down that gold base coat, just because I spent a lot of time going back over it and covering up the base coat as opposed to just glazing down from, say, a white, which would have been a lot easier and probably made it faster to get the highlights in that I wanted to get in. Also notice I'm not being overly careful about painting over some of this detail. We're gonna come back later on as we highlight it, and we're just gonna keep ending up painting over and over and over again. But the paints are fairly thin, so I'm not worried about obscuring the detail. And when we go back later on and actually paint that detail, the blue will do just fine as a shadow color. So you don't necessarily need to worry about it all that much. All right, there it is. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to apply some shades to the gold armor. Now I started with a Reichland Flush shade, but I found that although it works, it didn't quite get the shadows deep enough on the gold. It still looked super bright, especially on the parts that I did the zenithal highlighting, and just not enough contrast down in the shadows. So I went back over it with Agrax Earth Shade and just made sure that got into all the recesses, and that's going to do a pretty good job of building our shadow. Now we will have to go in after this though, because of all that shading is kind of taking out a lot of the bright zenithal highlighting that we've done. But we'll go back in and bring some of that back with a fairly quick dry brushing method that'll do a decent job of building up the highlight once again. You notice one thing that I did here that I regret is I was using a good paintbrush to apply these washes. That's that's one of my Raphael paintbrushes, and this is before I learned that all those washes just soak right up into the ferrule and have a tendency to ruin your paintbrushes. After painting these guys, I basically had to go out and buy new paintbrushes because those no longer held a decent tip. So that was kind of disappointing. So putting another wash there, Gray Fun Sepia over the exterior white robes. Just making sure I get it a nice amount in all the recesses. Okay, so as I mentioned, we got some of those shadows in there and they look good, but now we've washed out all of the highlights. So we're gonna go back over it with some polished gold, either from the Vallejo Model Air or Game Air line, or I think I'm using P3 polished gold here. They're almost the exact same color, so it works just fine. Just use a makeup brush. Go to Target, go to Walmart, go to a standard store where they have a cosmetics section, and this is like a small concealer brush, and it's got really nice soft soft bristles on it. And it does a great job at doing smooth transitions or doing smooth work on miniatures, specifically on large armor blocks, or even on the robes. You see I'm going to use this on the robes to some pretty good effect. But what we're doing here is just hitting all those all those areas that are in direct light of the sun, and also all the areas where we need the edges to really pop from the shadow in the background, so that we can see them, so that they're defined. One of the things that I want to make sure too is I'm still, despite the fact that these areas underneath, they're not really highlights, but never forget with metal that light reflects from all directions. So you're gonna have light reflect up from the bottom, you're gonna have light reflect up off of the ground. It's not gonna be as strong as the light that's coming from the sun and from the sky, but it'll still be there. So you'll still be able to see. You still want the definition. You still want the edges picked out in the areas that aren't necessarily coming directly from the sun. So we still want to hit those areas with the dry brush with the highlight color, so that it picks those out and it'll end up looking a bit more realistic. And then it'll also have an effect of the parts that we don't hit with the shadows will appear that much darker, being in close proximity to the highlights. And then we just really build up the highlights on the areas that are in direct sunlight. Okay, now that we have the gold armor done, we will go back and highlight it, but we're going to do the same dry brushing method, this time on the robes. I used my mid-tone color, or what I wanted my mid-tone color to be, which was Vallejo model color turquoise. It is a dry brush technique. I take a little bit of paint on there, and either I just make sure that there's pretty much nothing on there, or I dab a little bit onto a paintbrush. But contrary to normal dry brushing technique, at this point using the mid-tone, I'm not really brushing it out to the point where it's dry. But the nice thing about this makeup brush is, you see right there, actually, I didn't take any of it out at all. I even put probably a little too much on that brush and went right onto the shield. You can see where at the very bottom it stands out a bit. But the nice thing about this makeup brush and the technique is that it will actually smooth out really, really, really well. One time I did a giant, an old school giant with this way back during the early, like around 2010, and I did this entire skin like this, and it looked fantastic. So we slowly add white into the mixture with the turquoise, and then just using that dry brush or the makeup brush, slowly build it up, layer after layer, and you don't have a whole lot of paint on the brush, so it doesn't create any hard lines. If you're getting hard lines out of it that you can see on the model, one of two things needs to happen. Either you need to put a better transition color in there in between your paints, so don't add quite so much white to the turquoise, or you do need to take a little bit of that paint off. If you have too much paint on there, obviously, then the difference will be too stark, and it's not going to work. So we just keep building up over and over and over again, a little more white paint, and then hitting all those edges, spending successively less time on each edge and on each part of the model as we add more white to it. So when there's turquoise only, we spend a ton of time working it in towards the shadow color and just really making sure that we've got a good smooth blend, and it's pretty close to the base color, so you're not going to see a hard line in there, or it's not going to be too bad, too apparent, and we're going to be able to go in later on and glaze it out. And then just as you add white to it, and I apologize here, my camera was a little bit off center and I kept coming off screen at the bottom of the screen. But you know, you just add white, and as you add white, then you spend less time dry brushing with that white, and you hit fewer areas with, you know, kind of a lighter touch, and repeat that process over and over again, and you'll get a nice smooth blend up to your highlight color. One of the things that will happen in this process is you'll get the gold dirty and have to go and fix that up. So the next step in the process, though, is this is, you know, the dry brushing method isn't perfect, and it still does leave some harsh transitions, or even as you get up towards the white, it does appear to be a little bit more grainy or a little bit more chalky. And so we fixed that with applying a really thin glaze of the mid-tone of that turquoise from Vallejo Game Color, you know, and just applying that turquoise glaze over and over and over again, down in, you know, between the highlighted areas and then down into that dark base blue color, will give you a really nice transition, because the dry brushing technique will have done a really good job of establishing highlight areas that then the glaze won't remove. That will still end up being brighter than everywhere else because of the white that's underneath it, and that will show through, and the glaze just basically kind of tints it. And so I decided I was going to try a little bit of loaded brush technique here, where you have the mid-tone in the brush with some white at the end, and then you go in and you essentially blend it on the model. That didn't work out for me so well. But I did get a pretty nice bright highlight color, and I just went in, voided my brush out, and then essentially kind of feathered or blended out the blended what went on the model, blended it out, and then continue to go back in with either just some water or a little bit of the glaze, and, you know, smoothing that out, and going in and building up the highlight color, and then feathering it out again. And just repeat this process over and over and over again, doing some edge highlighting on on all the various raised edges. I mean, this is almost a pure white that we're putting down. It's not quite white, but it is almost a pure white. And then going back again with the glaze of the mid-tone and laying that in there to smooth out the transitions between the highlight and the dark points. So you just keep going back and forth through this process. I don't show all of it here for all of the models because there's no way that you want to watch that, but you get the basic idea of how I did it there. Again, putting in the highlight and then just getting some water and a brush and feathering it out, and just repeating that over and over again. Now, as it stands right now, this shield doesn't quite look finished. But one of the things that I've noticed is that you just have to get the general highlight in there, and when you go back in later on and you put in the details like the hammer and the white lightning coming out and the anvil and all that other stuff, your eye is not going to be focused, or anybody who's looking at it, their eyes are going to be drawn more towards those details. So at least for me, going for a tabletop level or a good quality tabletop level miniature, you know, this will do. You don't have to spend a ton of time going back and forth and trying to get the perfect smooth blend. But overall, I think this looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it for a tabletop level. So we're gonna move on. All the hafts of the weapons get this screamer pink because it makes a nice little base coat there it makes a nice little base color for kind of a reddish mahogany leather straps that contrasts nicely between the gold and the blue that's already on the armor, as well as kind of the creamish color of the robes. So we just put that down on all of the weapon hafts and everywhere else, you know, on the miniature. Not too much, honestly. And then we wanted to make the interior portion of these robes different, obviously, than the outside, so they stand out. So we went with red, just using a sanguine base red from P3 Miniatures. It is a fantastic base color red if you are going to use a layering technique. It's nice. It's very, I think it's desaturated is the right word, where it's just very dark, and great for working up into other red colors. So just, repeatedly put a few layers of that on, and then moving up in hue for the reds, moving to a carmine red from Vallejo Model Color, which is more of the mid-tone that we're using here. And again, just layering it on, standard layer technique, where you put it on successively smaller portions and the higher raised portions, and then moving again to the next higher level of red, just straight up red from Vallejo model line. All right, we do the same thing with the hair, starting from that sanguine base, moving up through the shades of red. One of the things that I struggle with is doing this hair, because the way that it's modeled and the way that I paint, I often get the highlight colors down into the crevices, so you gotta go back later on and put a wash in there to bring those shadows back. But eventually you add some Ember Orange from P3, or I added Ember Orange from P3. I find that to be a great color to mix with reds to get a good highlight color, because I'm one of those people that doesn't like to highlight red with white, because I don't like that pinkish look. I kind of like more of the orangish, fiery look for a bright red. So as I mentioned, putting some crimson shade into the hair to bring back the shadows, and then putting the Druchii Violet onto the haft of the weapon to bring out the details of the leather straps there. The next thing we want to move on to is the robes. So like I said, we wanted these robes to be a bit more warm, to contrast the coolness of the blue robes. So went to Zandari Dust, and then work our way up with some dark sand. All right, hitting all the raised areas, and then again just using a layering technique to hit the raised areas, leaving that Zandari Dust in the folds of the cloak, but just putting this down on all the raised edges. The technique that I'm using here to blend these robes is a combination of layering and feathering, essentially hitting with paint that's not hitting the high edges with a paint that's not particularly watered down. But I find that the line actually, when you put it onto a wet palette, you don't really have to water it down too much. You should still be able to to use it as a layering method, and the first layer will be slightly translucent, and you put a second layer on top of that, and it'll come through nicely. So this is the same method. You notice he's got that scroll hanging off of the side of him there. We'll use the same color scheme to paint that scroll, going Zandari Dust, only this time on that you'll use Agrax Earthshade to get a darker, dirtier color, but then using the same dark sand followed by pale sand on the highlights over there on the scroll, but you can even take that up to a white, just because it's a different material, and having that different shade underneath and then going to white on those scrolls, it'll appear to be a different texture, it'll appear to be a different part of the miniature. It won't look the exact same. So again, just layering up the sand colors, and now going to almost an edge highlighting with pale sand from Vallejo Model Color, and just putting it right there on all the raised edges on all the raised folds for the exterior robe. Again, these aren't particularly watered down. And you can see just how thick it is there on my my thumb. Just tested it. Wick a little bit extra off. So overall, the robes, you can get away with just a combination of layering and, at least the front robes, a combination of layering and edge highlighting. So now we're moving on to all the rest of the model. Anywhere where there's white, we're starting off with a pallid witch flesh. Now this is actually really watered down on these parts. You have to be careful because if it's if you have too much water or watered down paint in your brush as you're hitting these models, it'll just run right off of the detail parts that you're trying to paint. But you do want it, so you need to wick that off. But you do want it to be fairly thin. And what this will help you with is, although you have to do multiple layers, I've noticed that if you just go straight to white on this, even if you paint it all exactly perfectly, it's gonna look a little bit funky and a little bit weird. And so with that, the thin layers kind of allows you just to build it up in the right spots so that it doesn't appear too stark everywhere. And then just doing the same thing on those robes underneath. Like we mentioned, I wanted these to be a little bit cooler because they're on the inside. So just using that really thin down pallid witch flesh over that Rakoth flesh that's underneath, just building it up from the Rakoth flesh in the recesses with really watered down glazes till eventually you're glazing white over the very edges. And again, putting in kind of a base layer of a Rakoth flesh, or not a Rakoth flesh, a pallid witch flesh with white on top. And obviously, especially when you're doing these little mini details, it's especially important to wick off excess paint before you attempt to apply the paint using any sort of edge highlighting technique or whatever to those parts. Now, I actually forgot to base coat the gauntlets and all the black parts, so I'm doing that now, which is okay, because up to this point, all the things that we've been painting, there's high likelihood we would have accidentally painted over that black anyway, especially when we did a lot of the dry brushing. So we would have had to gone back and fixed it up anyway. So we highlight all of the black gauntlets and everything with some dark gray from Vallejo Model Color, and I tried to do glazing with the gray, and that I was fairly unsuccessful over black, and I found that I was best off with essentially kind of doing a thick edge highlighting and then going back in with a watered down black and putting that watered down black over some of the thick, the gray that had gone down, and that helped to get somewhat of a transition, but it really didn't really remove quite that edge highlighting look that's pretty stark on those, but it worked. So finally, we go in with a combination of cold steel and then also some mithril silver color on all of the silver parts, or the parts of the miniature that we want to be bright steel metal color, and then we use the same steel color to edge highlight all of the gold armor. Okay, now if you've ever watched any videos on either non-metallic metal, they'll tell you that essentially you work your way up towards white and non-metallic metal. And in true metallic metal, if you look at it, there are parts when it's reflecting against you that actually look white, or very like silver, like a bright silver. It is extremely close. It still has the reflective quality of metal, so it does a really, really fantastic job of being that highlight edge color on all the gold parts. And so, we edge highlight all of the gold armor in that, as well as hitting some of the other spots that we want to be particularly bright, like the rivets. So the weapon's got this like essentially kind of glowing, or I wanted it to be a glowing gem-like thing on the inside. I guess that's where the power comes from. So that's just a matter of working your way up from a dark green up to almost white in the very center of that gem. At this point, go through, put a wash down on some of the metal parts to build in some contrast and some shadow in there, and then we'll go back later with just a little bit more silver and edge highlight those so we get some nice contrast and color there. Finally, I figured I would talk a little bit about these bases that I did, because I also get a lot of questions about my basing techniques and how I did it. Starting, this is a burnt umber base coat that's going to be underneath for all of them. But this is essentially, the material is just a combination of baking powder or baking soda, can never remember which one, the Arm & Hammer one, and then sand, like a super fine sand, and then a bit of a larger, more like playground sand, and some small little pebbles and rocks and basalt and stuff. And you just mix that up, and you can either drop it, put some glue onto the base and then drop it in the mixture, or you can mix that up with glue and then just spread it out on your base, and you'll get the same effect. Just make sure if you don't mix it with glue that you put a coat of glue over the top, because otherwise all that baking powder will come off into your brushes and you'll be very upset. So work your way up from burnt umber, graveyard earth, fantastic color I wish Games Workshop never got rid of, through Zandari dust, and then you hit the rocks with gray, maybe put a wash over them, maybe then highlight them with like some sort of stone grayish color, or a light gray like Administratum gray or something like that from Games Workshop, and that's pretty much it. Add some flock, add some tufts of grass or static grass, and there you have it. That's how I painted these Stormcast. I hope you like it. I hope this helped you, or you found this video helpful in some way, shape, or form. I really enjoyed painting these guys. I'm painting my entire Stormcast army this way, and I think it looks really good. If you liked this video, if you found it helpful, please like and subscribe. Leave some comments down below. I'd love to hear any ideas you have for future painting videos or things you want to learn about. And as always, I appreciate you taking the time to make it all the way through this video, and I hope you have good luck in your painting, and let me know what you think. Thank you for watching.